Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Anders Ebro from Denmark, and I've been a Access developer for 14, 15 years now, and a SQL developer for, I guess, about 10 of those years. And my topic for today is going to be how do we build a secure Access and SQL Server solution. So before we get started, I just want to try to get a feel of the room and hear how familiar people are with using SQL Server. So I try to get a kind of show of hands for those with camera. How many of you use SQL Server every day? Okay, so I get Kent and Bob, who I can see. Okay, SQL Server security can, be really complex, and 1 hour is not nearly enough time to cover all of SQL Server security. And I think when the first time I tried to do this presentation, I ended up with a 3-hour presentation. So obviously I've had to cut a lot of material from the presentation. So with that in mind, the focus for today is going to be how we set up permissions for users that are connecting to SQL Server with Windows Authentication, and focus on Windows Authentication, Active Directory, user groups. Then we're going to focus, once we have that connection, we're going to focus on custom database roles, but I'm also going to talk about object level security, column level security, and row level security when we want to get really complex with how we want our permissions set up. Now, I think a difficult aspect of security is that we might think we have built a really super strong gate and everything is great, but the gate might very well be indestructible, but have we made sure that we cover all access roads to our server? I think this is a pretty common scenario that people think they've made a super secure access with Access backend, and they brag about how it's virtually impossible, and then it takes an experienced programmer a couple of seconds to go past all of that security that they've put in place. Or it might be that we have security that turns out to be nothing but a waste of time, because everyone needs to have the password anyway. I think this is one of the things with Access databases. You can put a password on it, but everyone needs to have the password to use the database. So it doesn't really make much sense in my world. So the truth is that really secure applications can be time consuming to build. There's no doubt about it. But if we know what we're doing, we can come a long way even on a limited budget for time. But before we dive into all of the techie stuff, I just wanted to briefly share a bit of my own background so that you know a little about me and also a little about my experience on how we do these complicated setups. I've been a principal consultant with a company called Exacto, and I obviously haven't updated this slide because it's been 7 years now. Based out of Denmark, we have 18 employees, and we recently opened 2 branches in Germany. Been a full-time Access SQL developer for 14 years, and 11 of those with SQL Server. And over the last few years, through my work in Exacto, I've been doing a lot of Excel and SQL instead of Access and SQL. We did a big Access Excel SQL-based incentives tool or rewards tool to handle performance review for a financial institution. And this application had data on 25,000 employees. It had about 800 users that were managers in this financial institution. And we had a different user role for some local admin and super admin. Then we had the developers. And there's a lot of money going through this system every year. And there's a lot of sensitive data, both on the employees and what are their salary and such. So obviously something where security was a pretty important aspect to have. Now, not every solution needs to be super secure, but each time you do make a solution, you need to at least consider the security aspect, even if that consideration is just to say that we don't really need any extra layer of security for this. This is just our simple application for keeping track of who took out equipment, who loaned that equipment last. But with SQL Server, we want to ensure that access to our sensitive data is limited. We want to ensure that users can only update data according to their role, which could be user, manager, administrator, or some other role. And finally, we also want to do is we want to limit what can happen in case one of our account gets hacked. Because it's one thing to prevent against malicious or people that are working in the system as users, but we also want to make sure that we limit what happens if they get hacked. And so the thing is, if we make sure that we don't give users more access than they need, then we're limiting it. We don't want every user to come in as the database owner, because if their account get hacked, then the risk of something going really bad is much higher. With SQL Server, databases can have rights granted at the database level. One of these rights is actually a role which is called data reader and data writer. These give full read and write access to every table. So we can grant those at the entire database level. In the following examples, I'm going to assume that we need to be a bit more granular about what we want to do. We don't want to give access to the entire database at once. We want to be more specific about which objects we grant permissions for. Since we're on the topic of security, I'll say one more rule that I want to point out is don't store data that you don't need. This is especially true for sensitive data, because if you have credit card information and you don't actually need to store it, then don't store it, because you're just taking an unnecessary risk that if you do get hacked, your company is suddenly the company that exposed 10,000 credit cards to hackers, and you have to inform all your clients that, sorry, we didn't really need to store your data, but we did, and now someone else has access to it. So, application security versus SQL Server security. And by application security, I mean the type of application where all of the security logic is defined within the front end by front end code. So it's actually the application itself. With SQL Server security, I mean cases where all of the rules security-wise are defined directly on the SQL Server. Now, I want to start out with a short demo of how we access developers often see security implemented and why that can be inadequate. So let's fire up this application. So let's say I have a really secure access application.
Now we're seeing.
One moment. I seem to have managed to clean up a bit too much from my server. So let me just see if I can wing it. Okay, so I guess I'll have to skip this part. What I wanted to show was a case where you have all of the security in the front end. We have a form. I'll just show it in design view instead, where we have users and all of this is locked, was the idea. All of it locked down by front-end code. And then I have what I call a app hacker, which is basically another access application that can pick up information on the database that you're running. So once you have your database open, this application could basically take over your other application and do all sorts of things that you've through remote automation. It could look at what's the active forms, what are the controls on the form, or even just use that active connection to run a malicious query. So obviously this demo didn't go as good as I expected. So I'll just try to move on to other cases. And the thing I wanted to show with this demo was that having security in the application layer is not good enough if your data is critical. And we might as well just go ahead and try to use what SQL Server has for us instead of trying to reinventing our own security. What's special about Access is that we have direct user access. We have a connection directly to the database, where when you're looking at web applications, what they have is they have a server that parses your SQL and sends it off to a SQL database. Here we have users that access the database directly. They have read and write access, usually or often on all tables. And then we can say, well, we don't expose it through a form, but if the user has access, he could even open up Management Studio on his own machine, connect to the server, and then use it from there. To start with SQL Server Security, at the server level, we need to define a login before we can even get started. At the database level, we have to define a user account, which is tied to a single login. And then we can start defining permissions. The usual most common permissions are select, insert, update, delete, or for stored procedures and functions, it's execute. Or we want to define for our user account what's known as role membership. So imagine we have a lot of users, and in this example, we're going to call them Billy Badger and John Johnson, and try to look at our demo here. So I have my database. It's called Seattle. You can try to guess where the first time I made this presentation was. So I'll start by creating a login on the server. So this is created at the server level. So I'm creating a login for the user JJ. This will show down up in security, logins, and we can now see my JJ login. Now using the database, use Seattle, I want to create a user that is tied to that login. So if we go inside the database, security, users, this is where I see the user I just created. So if the user has the AD account, JJ, then he can now access our server. But right now, all he has is a connection to the server. He doesn't have access to anything within the database yet. Now I want to go ahead and say this user may have select permissions on the sales table, and he may have update permissions on the sales table. So let's go ahead and try to see how that works from the application. But before I do that, I'll say you can also have select, insert, update, delete. You can also add multiple permissions at the same time. But if we have hundreds of users, just zoom a bit in on this, with a lot of apps. And this was a case, if I wanted to do this for my Billy Badger guy from before, then I'd have to do all of the same setup for him. And imagine if you have 100 users, you don't want to go through all of your objects one at a time and saying, well, create the login, create the user, and grant all of the permissions. And this was just 2 permissions. But if you have 100 tables, you don't want to do that and have to grant the permissions one at a time to hundreds of users on hundreds of objects. So what we're going to do instead is I'll go back and I'll clean up what I just did. I'll drop the user. I'll drop the login. And what I want to do is, now you might have remembered that both Billy and John, they were members of an AD group called salespeople. So instead of creating individual access for John and Billy, I want to create a login for the AD group that they're a member of. So again, we create the login, Again, it's done at the server level. Now I create a user, salesperson, for that login, again at the database level. So this means that what you might think is that all of the members of the group salespeople would now be identified as salesperson, and you want to be specific about who is the user. Is it actually John or Billy that's doing the stuff? So there's this function that you can use called system user. So in this case, you can see it's returning exacto AEC. That's my domain and my username. And the same goes, even though I'm still coming in as a user, I'm still getting their Windows user account. So one of the things you can do in SQL is you have this execute as user permission. To use it, you have to have impersonation rights on your server. But if you do have that, then I can do this execute as user. And what would the system user return then? So now it's returning my computer name and the user. So even though this user is connected through the salespeople AD account, it's still returning his individual username when I say system user. And to undo this execute as user, I run a revert. And I can see if I do my select system user, that I'm back to being myself. So all members of the salespeople group now have database access, and they can connect because I just added the user. I didn't add anything else. So they can't view anything. They can't update anything yet. This was to point out that instead of doing things per user, we want to do things per AD group. So if you have a low budget, low security solution, we can use the two built-in database roles called DB Data Reader and DB Data Writer. I can do it like this: alter role DB Data Reader, add member, and then I could write my sales people. This would grant the user full read and write access, or full read with data reader and full write with data writer access to all tables in the database. Now, this might not be practical if what you want is something really secure, but if your system is low security, and you just want to use SQL Server, but you don't want to set up a lot of different things, there's no budget for it. If you grant people data reader and data writer, then it's quite similar to what you have in Access. You have access in theory to everything, and then you can still have your application security on top of this if you want. But we could also do custom user roles. So DB Data Reader and DB Data Writer are roles that come with SQL Server. You can't drop the roles, they're always there. But we can make our own roles instead. And then we'd start getting much more control over what our users can and can't do. Let's try to take a look at this custom user role. As I already showed, this was the syntax for adding them to the roles. So we'll create our own role, call it role sales, and I'll add the sales person to that. And I'll say that they can run selects on my sales. You could also do it at the schema level. So I'll say you can select everything from the DBO schema. This is useful if you have multiple schemas. And if you want to ungrant a permission, you do a revoke. So grant select on the entire schema and revoke that selection, or revoke that granting of a selection.
So could you grant a selection to a group and then revoke it for an individual?
That would be a deny syntax. You can grant on everything and then deny on a specific object. I don't usually use the deny because it can be quite complicated, especially when you have multiple roles at play at the same time, but it is one way to do it. Of course, testing is key. And as I showed before, I showed how you could do testing on the server by using the execute as. But how can we fake being another user? Because we are often developers and we have the full access rights. We have, I'm a member of the DB owner group when I do my development, which means I have full permissions on everything, which makes it difficult to test. So within SQL Server, we have the execute as, but Windows has a program called run as, which can be used to execute under different security context. And the syntax, which I just create a shortcut file on my desktop and use this syntax. We have the path to the run as, and then I specify the user. I specify the program that I want to run. In this case, it's Microsoft Access. And finally, I pass in a parameter, which is the path to my database. I don't need to pass in the parameter to the database, but I can do it. So I'll run my Access application as JJ. So I have here a shortcut file. If we just take a quick look, properties, and this is the long path to my Access file, the run as. What happens when you click it is that you're prompted for the password for the user. So I'll type in the password. And now it opens my database as that user. And you can test it by calling the environ function. You can see the user is JJ. So this application that I opened is now working as JJ. And I'll add a linked table. Table sales. If we try to open it up, we can see I can see everything, which makes sense because I added the select permission for the table. But if I try to edit anything, I'm going to be informed that the update failed, the update permission was denied. So the user I am, JJ, does not have update permissions yet. So I can view everything, but I cannot update everything, and I cannot circumvent this security in any way. So one of the things I like about the AD group is that IT is now able to handle users, because if IT adds a new user that, Bob just got hired, and now Bob was added to the AD group salespeople, then Bob has permissions on the database. We don't need IT to go in and grant permissions within the database. And that makes me happy because I don't want IT messing up stuff in my database thinking they know what they're doing. Oftentimes I see that people contact IT. The first thing they do is they add people to the data reader and data writer role. I'm like, no, you shouldn't do that because we have a specific role for it. I've set up a role for salespeople and I want them to use that. And that comes through the AD. So before we proceed, I just want to briefly return to some clarification on the terms rights, objects, and principles. So the basic principle is you grant a right on an object to a principal. Some of the rights could be insert, select, update, delete, your basic CRUD operations, or execute for procedures and functions. There are other permissions you can grant, such as the permission to create a login, the permission to create a table. Objects can be tables, views, stored procedures, functions, entire schemas, or even just a single column in a table. There are other things as well. We won't go there right now. And principals can be a user, such as a Windows user or a Windows group. It can be a custom role, so I can grant permissions to a role, and it could be other things. The main point I don't want to stress again is don't ever grant rights directly on users. We want to use either a AD group or, even better, a custom role. One of the benefits of using a custom role is that we might have cases where we don't have a single sales people group, but we might have sales east, sales west, sales north. And if we just create one custom role, then we can add those 3 groups to the custom role, and they'll all have the same permissions. And it's all defined within one single role instead of having to define it for all of the 3 groups. Now that we have our simple rights set up, we need to make sure that our Access app behaves like it should, because for a good user interface, for good user experience, the interface should adapt. I mean, what we don't want to show the new row in Access, this row down here. We don't want to show this row if the user doesn't have insert permissions, because that would be a bad user interface. So we need to make sure that our interfaces adapt. I won't show an example of this, but I am sure you know how to modify settings such as allow edits and allow inserts so that your Access database matches what permissions the user has. If you have multiple roles and you want to check if the user is a member of a role, there's a really simple function here I wrote, is member and what's the role name, which creates a pass-through query on the fly. I pass it in a connection string. The thing is, if you do this current DB create query def and you pass in a blank name, then that query is not stored. It isn't saved. I pass in the SQL. So I have a SQL function that's called isMember. It's a built-in function. And the role name, I execute it with the .openRecordSet, and I just grab the first field from that return value. So this isMember is going to return true or false on my role. So that way I can, if I want my Access application to say, well, if you're a member of salespeople, then allow additions for this form. But for now, I want to focus on the SQL Server side of it. So I want to expand a bit on what we can do. We've seen how we granted access to the server, to the database, and finally the table itself. But what if we want to be even more granular in our permissions? What if we don't want to allow access to the full table? In this case, we had our sales, and you can see I have a credit card column. But what if we only want to show some of these columns to the user? Because maybe we don't want the salesperson to be able to view the credit card that was used for the sale. So we can do this by granting column level security. And the syntax is grant select, and then in a parenthesis, you put the columns that you want them to be able to select. You can also do the same for update permissions. So I'll say you can update the sales amount, but you can't change who the salesperson was. Again, I don't want my Billy Badger to start stealing sales from John by applying his own name to other people's sales. So still using the Seattle database, and I revoke all permissions on table sales from role sales. I go ahead and say, I give select permissions on these 4 columns, and I grant update permissions on just the sales amount. But how is this going to work from Access? Let's see how the user experience is. close my sales table, try to open it again. I'm being informed that the call failed because when I try to open the entire table, it tries to access all of the columns and can't do that. And we now have this, you can see there's data, but you're not getting the full picture. But I can go and create a query sales where I'm selecting just these 4 columns from the table. And this query I can run. And I can tie a form to this query. So even though the user JJ doesn't have full permissions on the table, he can still access just these columns if you make sure to exclude the columns he's not allowed to. And I granted update on the sales amount, so I can still update the sales amount. So I've been able to hide that specific column from the user. So what if we want users to only be able to see some rows, but not all rows? This is called row level security. And it means we can restrict which rows which users can see. For instance, you might want to restrict a hospital nurse to only be able to view the records of the patients that are assigned to her ward, or we only want to let salespeople see their own orders within the system. With SQL Server row level security, this limitation is defined at the server instead of in the application. So there's no way you can circumvent it, even if you open up, your own management studio or try to open up Excel and connect that to your database. But we can implement it in different ways. One of the ways is by using a view. So let's go ahead and so first we start by removing all permissions on the sales table again. Now I create a view, which is called select all of my columns from table sales, and I put a filter on saying where the salesperson is equal to the system user. So I'll create this view. I'll grant select, insert, delete all of the 4 CRUD on view sales. And let's see how that works from our Access application. So I'll add a link table to view sales. And comes up and what's the unique identifier? Let's say sales ID. And when I open the view as John Johnson, I'm now only seeing John's own records. So and he can't prevent this because I revoked permissions on the sales table. So I can't select anything from the sales table. I can't use the query I defined before because I don't have select permissions on the sales. But because he's granted permissions on the view, and the view can select from the table as long as they're in the same schema, then I now have applied user level filtering on what he can see. But what if you want some groups to be able to see all of the roles, all of the views? Because if I do a select from view sales as my own user account, it looks like the table is empty. So if we modify our view to say, I want to look at cases where the salesperson is equal to the user or is a member, we mentioned this before, is a member of the database owner group. So I'll modify my view and do a new select from. So now Anas, I can view all of the records in the table, and JJ can sorry. Failed because I didn't actually add the same columns to the view. There we go. JJ can still only view his own records, but I can view all records. So one more thing I want to explain is this with check option. It's basically saying that when you update a record or insert a record into the view, the new updated record must still follow the same rules. So if I have something where I'm filtering on the system user, then JJ can't add a record to someone else. Let's see how that looks. I haven't done the with check yet, but I could go in now and switch one of the records to someone else. And if I do a refresh, it's not there anymore because it got filtered out from my view. But if we add this view check, then it's, let me just remember this time to add the credit card. So I've added the with check option. So if I try to do the same now, the insert or update failed because it has the with check. So I can't make a record disappear from the view. Of course, the with check, you can't always use it because you might have cases where only select the active rows, and you still want the user to be able to deactivate a row, and then the with check wouldn't work. Or it would work, but you wouldn't be able to deactivate the row if that's what you were trying to do. So another way we can do row level security is what's called SQL Server Security Policy. And it's started in SQL Server 2016. And let's see how that works. So a security policy is something that you apply for tables. So I'll start by creating a separate schema for it and say this is still owned by the DBO. I'll create a function that takes the salesperson as an argument and returns a table. This function is quite simple. Select one as row visible where salesperson is system user. So this function, if I pass in JJ, it's going to return 1 if salesperson is equal to JJ. Then I'll create a security policy with a filter predicate. So I have a policy with this name. It's working on the sales table. And it's basically calling this function I just built up here, passing in the salesperson. Now it's passing in the salesperson as the column in the sales table. So I'll go back and grant full rights on the table, our role to my role sales. And I need to grant select on the schema for the user to be able to run this function. Okay, so let's go back, close this, go into table sales. So even though I'm opening the full table, my table is filtered by the user. The same way, if I try to look at the server, I'm selecting everything from the sales table. Well, the sales table is empty. I can just go ahead and delete it, right? So when you use security policies, you have to be aware that this also affects your user when you're at the server. But I've now filtered directly on the sales table. I've applied this filter. So if I create a new view, the view sales is also going to be filtered. Everything is filtered already directly at the table level, which is a great way to do security because I don't have to remember to do the filtering on my view sales and view reporting, and I don't have to do it everywhere. It's just done once. So I can as I showed the with check before, the kind of thing that corresponds to it when you're using security policy is the block predicate. It has the same functionality that I can't change who the I can't change a row so it falls out of the security policy. And as administrator, we have this administrator override, which for the view was adding this is member. In the same way, I can modify my security function to say I want the row to be visible when the salesperson is the system user or is a member of the DB owner. So if I run that and then try to select everything from table sales, you can see as the database owner, I now see all the records again. So sometimes, so far we've only looked at granting or restricting simple CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. And sometimes this is not enough. The more critical the data or the more complex the update operation, the more likely it is that you're going to want to use a stored procedure to update the data. View then, in this case, what I'll usually do is I'll set up a view for browsing. I'll set up a temp table in Access for looking at that specific record. And then I'll use VBA when the record updates to run a stored procedure on the server. And then I can requeue when everything is done. So I have a employee list here, which is bound to, I think, view employee info. And I can view stuff here. I don't know. So I don't have time to go into full detail here of how it's built, but I just want to say we have our view, it has the information. Then I have a temp table. So when you click this view button, what it does is it inserts from the server into the temp table and then opens this detail form, which is bound to the temporary table. And then I have code that will execute when I try to do something. Now, it seems I might have granted too much permission on this form, which is why I was able to edit data. But the idea being that the stored procedure is supposed to handle the update. And the stored procedure, as I'm calling it, is checking whether I am the employee's manager. So if we jump into SQL Server for a moment, we have this Seattle Secure database, and I have an employee table, and I have a stored procedure called set employee bonus, because I don't want people to be able to edit the bonus directly, but I want them to be able to execute a stored procedure, which is doing it, but it's not just doing the update directly, because I want checks to be done. So I have a stored procedure, set employee bonus, which gets an employee ID and a bonus amount. And the first thing it does is it's going to check that the user is the employee's manager. So I'll do a select, I'll check if exists, if not exists, and select from the table, filtering on the employee ID and the department manager. Now, if this returns nothing, then it's because you're not the employee's manager. And what I do then is I throw an error message and I pick up that error message from Access. I can do more validations here. For instance, saying if the bonus amount is too high, then you're not allowed to do this. So I can have a lot of checks here to make really complicated business logic that shouldn't be implicated directly in the Access front end, because I want to make sure that it's always run. But if it validates all of the checks, then I'll issue the update statement. So these are used. I'm a manager for the Copenhagen sales department. See this in department, who is the manager, Copenhagen sales. Nope, it was the Amsterdam I was for. So I can go here and try to update. That worked fine. You can see it also updated here. If I try to do too big a bonus, we see we get this message back from the server that we couldn't do the update. So if we try to take a look at it behind the scenes, the employee detail. So whenever the bonus amount updates, we try to kick off a stored procedure with some code, server command SP custom code, which is basically taking the name of the procedure. Now, and pass in an optional connection. If I pass in a connection, then I want to use that. If you didn't pass in a connection, then just use the default connection, which is another function. I pass in the name of the stored procedure. I tell it that the command type is a stored procedure, and I pass in the name of my stored procedure. And this is the important part. I do a command parameters refresh. This sends from Access a call to the SQL Server saying, what are the parameters that we want to use for our stored procedure? This is much easier. It's in adding code where you specify the parameters yourself and saying you have a parameter, this is of type integer and a parameter of type string. Just do a refresh on the parameters. It takes a couple of milliseconds extra to call to the server and be informed what the parameters are, but it's much easier and you don't have to update your code when you change a parameter. So going back to the detail, I kind of prepare the command with this, the ADO-DB command, and I pass in the parameters for the employee ID and the bonus, and I do an execute. So if everything goes fine, then we exit. If it doesn't go fine, then I listen for the error number. This is a SQL Server error that's returned when you do a throw. And on top of this, you can go and listen to the active connections errors description, which is returning either this message or this message. So I can have at the server level defined the error message that the user ends up seeing in the application. And then I do an undo on the bonus amount. So that was the small sample. Must be coming up on my time. So I'll just say that for new development, when we start a new project, we'll usually ask the client's IT to say, give us a database on your server, make sure that we as developers have DB owner membership, but also please create a test user with regular access to the database so I can use this execute as syntax or run as syntax. Now, usually the client's IT will create the database and set us up and give us this database ownership. But if it's on their systems, then we usually don't have the system administrator access, which means I can't create logins on my own. I can't create my own databases. This is usually the client's IT department. Then we'll either do development on our own server and port it to their server, or we'll do it directly through VPN or remote desktop. Sometimes the client doesn't want us to have a copy of their data, and then we use VPN or remote desktop. And despite the quirks of remote desktop, which sometimes can be frustrating, then I kind of prefer it that way. Now it's all of it is on their server. I don't have a copy on my own server. So that was what I had to share. And I think the time is now up for questions.
I have a question. It's not about security, but I know you know the answer. I was wondering on this, how can you use a stored procedure for the record source of a form?
So you'd have to do it through there's two ways. You can bind a record set. So you can open up a record set in code and then assign it to the form.
That would be
you can do this.
How would you do that?
You can technically.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You can technically do it both with ADODB and with a DAO record set. I usually like to use ADODB because it's much easier working with the parameters. The other way is you would create a pass-through in your database, create a pass-through query, and simply assign that as the record set.
Right,
but it wouldn't.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to edit it.
I know the pass-through, but and that is the problem. But I ran into a situation where there was a bunch of stored procedures, and I didn't know how to make them the record source of the form. Well, I'm not working on that anymore, but I still want to know how to do it.
Well, why wouldn't you just use a view?
So I see a lot of people, I've also seen this mentioned in forums a lot of times, that, when you have security, you should just create or for performance reasons, create a pass-through query so that you limit the amount of data. My experience has been it's much easier to use a view and bind to that view because Access doesn't, load all of the records. If we take a look at our employee list here, I see this is bound to the view, but I haven't loaded all of the records. Because it's Access, it'll only load as many records as is required to view the form. And if I start scrolling, it's just gonna, behind the scenes, load records as needed. And as you notice over here, the scroll bar this one is becoming smaller and smaller, because as I scroll the record set, Access realizes that this is a big table, and it's now making the scroll bar smaller and smaller to kind of illustrate that there's loads of records in the table. But I'm not loading all of those records. If I had bound this to a stored procedure, then that stored procedure would have to load all of the records. If I go all the way to the end, now Access knows how many records there are because it didn't start loading them until I viewed them. So I don't usually bind forms to stored procedures. I don't see the point. This example was basically when I click the button, load the data into my temporary table. And why do I load the data into the temporary table? Because it's easier to create. If I didn't have update permissions on the table, then if I tried to do updates, I'd get error messages. But I always have update permissions on my local table. I just overrule it by calling up a stored procedure.
it's generally pretty easy just to take a stored procedure and turn it into a view. That's not hard. The only issue you have with views is that you can't pass them a parameter. But as you're pointing out, you don't really need to, because Access looks after the pagination for you.
So let's take an example here. I have filtering at the top. I just type in what I want to filter on. And the code behind all of this is modifying the record source to, and this is much easier for you. If I tried to do the same with the stored procedure, I'd have to have the parameters. So I don't need the parameters, even though it's bound to a view. I just do a select from that view where department is like AMS. And still lightning fast. It's still the server that's doing the work, because the SQL is parsed, sent off to the server, and it's the server doing this work, even though it's a view.
Because you're filtering the view locally.
Yeah.
How are you filtering that view?
So list. When the form loads, I have my own custom code for the auto filter. So looking at it in the sign view, basically I have my continuous form where I show data. And in the same form, I've added these unbound objects, and they're all in the layout grid. And as you can see, department, it's the same column. So I use logic when the form opens to initialize an auto filter. And basically what it's saying is, if I type something in column 2, then automatically figure out the SQL and adjust it. So if we take our active form right now, look at the record source, it selects star from view employee info. And if I filter on Amsterdam, you see it has modified the SQL to filter on department name like AMS. So all of this is done with these couple of lines of code, because I don't want to have to maintain code that's specific to each.
So you're doing the filter in the front end. You're not passing a parameter to the back end to do it. You're just doing a like in the, yeah, okay. I like the way you've used the columns to do that.
Yeah, and as you can see, all of this, well, actually, these 4 lines is all I need to do the filtering.
Oh, I do like that.
And I do also have this these 2 defining lines or declarations at the top, but that's all I need to do the filtering. If I do a new form, that's all I need to add.
And you're not cleaning those up anywhere.
No, the form itself has, or the code itself has cleanup. Go have a look at it quickly. So the class has a terminate that cleans up on its own, and it listens in on the form's close event. So when the form closes, I clean up stuff from within here, all of the control references that it has, to minimize the amount of code I have.
Okay, but it can only filter on that one text box at a time.
No, I can do both.
Ah, That's good.
And I use the same when I have, tables that are 20 columns wide. And when the limitation is that I can't do stuff like bigger than 10 because it's just doing a like on all of the columns. For dates, it does do something specific. I don't recall off the top of my head since it's quite a long time since I wrote that code.
Fascinating. Well, if you got a couple more minutes?
Yep.
There are some questions in the chat.
Okay.
So you want to open the chat and read them, or should I read them to you?
I'll have the chat here. So,
Tom,
if he wants the script for the Seattle database, yes, you can get all of the scripts. Do they work on Azure databases as well? So most of them should, but for Azure databases, if you're using Windows Authentication, I haven't used Windows Authentication with Azure. There's something called Azure Active Directory, but I haven't used it yet. You ask if it's immune to SQL injection. Yes, it is, because as long as you're running with the user's permissions, then it's the user doesn't have permission to drop the table. That's one of the things I like about 80 versus trying to create a SQL authentication user. I didn't talk about SQL authenticated users where you create a login with a password. All of this is Windows passwords, so we're using the Windows account. Another complete topic could be SQL logins created. You can, on SQL, you could create user George with password 123, and then you connect to that server without using your Windows authentication, but using a SQL user instead. But I haven't talked about that because, as you saw, I had plenty of stuff to fill a full hour.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that was well worth the hour too. Is there anything else? Any other questions or comments, suggestions?
That's excellent. Excellent.
Yep.
Thank you, Brett.
Yeah, I was just going to mention is that what's interesting is because what I do today with it going into role level security and everything, our setup where I'm working now is the whole system is that, and it's also proving to be quite the pain right now because we don't have the execute as user ability.
Mm-hmm.
So right now I'm working on a report that somebody has can't see all their cars that are their rail cars that are supposed to be showing up on this report, and I can't even run the report because I can't even select the fleet for that because I don't have the correct permissions for that fleet. So yeah, it's a good thing, but it's also can be a real pain if they don't give developers a way to be able to look and see what those people are seeing so that you can actually troubleshoot it.
I agree with you there.
Yeah,
I don't work with users like that.
Yeah, we've all run into IT restraints like that, I'm sure.
Users who think they can hide the data from developers, I think, need a little re-education. So trying to get all this work with the Azure Active Directory is kind of my challenge at the moment. For a client who doesn't actually have their own server. And I've started to play with Azure Active Directory via 0365 admin. And the other day I was using that to create a group policy to overcome this impending issue with denying users the ability to click on the to run macros in a downloaded file. So I got that to work, but I'm now trying to get Azure Active Directory working with permissions for a SQL database. And one of the issues that has made that more difficult is I think that when Microsoft deprecated Windows workgroups for peer-to-peer networks, it stopped the previous. I was just having trouble getting users connected to a local SQL database on a peer-to-peer network. So I was just trying to see if I can get Azure Active Directory to manage that instead. And not so long ago, I was reading that SQL Server, you couldn't use Azure Active Directory for security, but then somebody said, oh, yes, you can. And I believe that they've actually implemented it, but I've yet to actually see it.
So I do have a coworker who's, as I understood it, set up for a client access through Azure Active Directory. And it works quite fine. Whenever they start the application, it comes up and asks for their login and even does the multi-factor authentication. And then they're working off that account. I haven't been involved in the project myself, but it seems to, from what I've heard, it's working fine. So it should be possible.
Yeah, it should be possible, whether or not. And one of the complications is that your Windows identification isn't necessarily the same as your Office or your Microsoft 365 user. And that can get a bit tricky. So if you run system_user in SQL, which one are you actually going to get back?
That would be only the Azure Active Directory account.
Mm. One would hope.
Any other questions?
Are there system tables that we can query with SQL to get this information?
Yeah, there's lots of system tables.
Didn't we really recently see something on getting metadata out of SQL Server? Who was it that presented that?
Yeah, Kim presented it, and I did ask her for her scripts, but I never got them.
So
I've got a whole lot of that stuff if you need it.
Oh, good. I do. I want it. Not that I need it. I just want it.
Yeah. I've got stored procedures there that'll give you all the columns and table names and even all the other constraints as well.
So just example, you have the permissions table, have the object table. And in this case, the object table has lots of stuff. But if I just want the user tables, for instance, I can filter on that. And you can see this is the 3 departments I have in my Seattle secured database. And you can play around with joining these together to get the information that you want.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So if that's it, we'll let Anders get a quick nap before he has to go to work. The rest of you, I thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to seeing you next month. I believe, Tom, are you up next month?
Yeah, I guess I am.
Yeah, so Tom's going to share some of his tips and tricks on working with Access. I won't, do you want to give us a quick preview of what you're going to do?
Well, I think you just asked me to show the temporary table business, which I had made a sample several years ago. I've done a little bit of adapting to it, but it was based on code that Dirk posted.
Yeah.
Dirk Goldgar.
Okay,
So,
great.
I mean, I
So-
don't think that part will take more than 15 minutes at most, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And then, maybe we can just kind of open it up to whatever.
Yeah, we can bring other questions or topics that people want to deal with. So we'll kind of pull back from SQL Server for a while and look back more at Access side until we're ready to move on.
I just got an email notice the other day that my subscription's due to expire at the end of the month for some Brent Ozar training. And I've been procrastinating. So all of a sudden I've been jumping on it. And I have to say, I'm learning some pretty interesting stuff. So maybe I could show some stuff from that.
That'd
I
be
don't
interesting. Yeah. Yeah, he started this thing where what he calls, I forget, he's in Mexico or someplace, and he does
know.
15-20 minute YouTube video of answering SQL Server questions from the beach in Cabo, where he's at.
Yep.
So,
Yep. I've seen a lot of those.
yeah.
Uh,
Okay, well, great. I thank you all again for joining us. We'll get the video up in a few days and look forward to seeing you all next month. Thanks. Good night.
So George,